Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. The Hitchhiker. It was late, much later than usual, when I left the office that night. The clock on the dashboard blinked past midnight as I pulled onto the winding, deserted road that led me home. The night was thick with fog, the kind that clings to your skin and warps the world around you, turning familiar landmarks into eerie shadows. I always found solace in these late-night drives. The silence, the emptiness of the road, and the soft hum of the engine provided a reprieve from the chaos of the day. But that night was different. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken tension that settled in my chest like a stone. About 10 miles from town, I first saw him. A man, standing alone on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. His figure was barely discernible through the mist, but there was something undeniably odd about him. He wore a long, tattered coat that fluttered in the night breeze, and his face was obscured by the hood that hung low over his eyes. I passed him without a second thought, my headlights illuminating his form for just a moment before the darkness swallowed him whole. I didn't stop. I never picked up hitchhikers, but a chill ran down my spine as I drove past. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to the cold night air and my overactive imagination. But then, a few miles down the road, I saw him again. Same spot, same posture, same eerie stillness. It was as if he had materialized out of the fog, waiting for me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. It didn't make sense. There was no way he could have gotten there before me. I hadn't passed any side roads, and even if I had, it would have been impossible for him to reach that spot so quickly. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles turning white as I sped up, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the hitchhiker as possible. For a while, the road was empty again, and I began to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But just as I started to relax, there he was once more, standing on the side of the road, waiting. This time, I could see his face, or rather, the lack of it. The shadows concealed his features, but his eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to follow me as I drove past. Panic surged through me, and I could feel my breath quicken as I pressed the gas pedal harder. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing there. Just the fog, swirling in the beams of my taillights. By the fourth time I saw him, my mind was reeling. Every corner I turned, every stretch of road I traveled, there he was, waiting, watching, his presence an ominous specter that clung to me like a shadow. I considered turning around, heading back to town, but something deep inside told me that it wouldn't matter. He would be there, no matter where I went. I could feel his gaze on me, cold and unforgiving, even when he was out of sight. It was as if the road itself had become a loop, a nightmarish carousel that I was trapped on, with no escape in sight. Finally, I reached a decision. I would confront him. I didn't know what I would say or do, but I couldn't continue like this. The fear had twisted into something more, a desperate need for answers, for understanding. So, when I saw him again, standing just ahead in the same haunting stillness, I slowed the car to a stop. The engine idled as I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my throat. The hitchhiker didn't move, didn't react. He just stood there, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. As the car idled, the low rumble of the engine felt like the only thing anchoring me to reality. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. What was I expecting to find out there in the fog? A man? A ghost? A figment of my exhausted imagination? The moment stretched on, filled with the weight of possibilities too terrible to consider. But something compelled me to push forward, to confront whatever was waiting outside. I stepped out into the cold night, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The fog curled around my ankles, thick and heavy, as I approached the figure standing by the side of the road. Up close, he seemed even more unnatural, his body unnaturally still, as if he were part of the landscape itself. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto mine, sending a shiver down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky and thin in the vast emptiness of the night. he didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question, or perhaps me. The silence between us was deafening, filled only by the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. I took a step closer, trying to steady my nerves. "Why are you following me?" I asked, more forcefully this time, though the fear in my voice was impossible to hide. Still, the hitchhiker said nothing. His face remained obscured by the shadows of his hood, but I could feel his gaze boring into me, a pressure that made my skin crawl. The longer I stood there, the more I became aware of something else, a presence, invisible yet palpable, pressing in around me. It was as though the fog itself was alive, wrapping me in its icy tendrils, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like the tolling of a distant bell. I wanted to run, to get back in the car and drive away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, held in place by some unseen force. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, he spoke. "You've seen me before, haven't you?" The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they cut through the silence like a knife. His voice was neither threatening nor comforting, it was empty, devoid of emotion, like the wind moaning through the trees on a desolate night. My mouth went dry as I tried to form a response, but no sound came out. I nodded slowly, the motion almost involuntary, as if my body were responding to some primal instinct. "I'll be with you for the rest of your journey," he continued, and this time, his voice carried a finality that chilled me to the bone. I opened my mouth to protest, to demand answers, but he raised a hand, and the words died in my throat. "It's too late," he said simply, lowering his hand again. "The road you're on, there's no turning back now." His words hung in the air like a death sentence, and a cold realization began to dawn on me. This wasn't just a hitchhiker. This was something else, something far more sinister. And whatever it was, it had claimed me. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog as if he had never been there at all. The night swallowed him whole, leaving me standing alone by the side of the road, trembling with a fear I could barely comprehend. I stumbled back to the car, my mind racing. As I fumbled with the door handle, I caught a glimpse of something in the back seat, a shadow, darker than the night itself. My heart leapt into my throat as I swung the door open, but there was nothing there, just the empty seats and the lingering scent of old leather. I collapsed into the driver's seat, hands shaking as I started the engine. The car roared to life, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there, but the back seat was empty. Still, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. I shifted into gear and sped off down the road, desperate to outrun the terror that clung to me like a second skin. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I heard a sound, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against leather. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, but every instinct screamed at me to look back. The car's interior felt stifling, the air thick with an unseen tension. The rhythmic thud of my heartbeat drowned out the hum of the engine, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill that had settled into my bones. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting the worst. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty back seat, dark and silent. But then, in the periphery of my vision, I saw a movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I focused on the mirror again, straining to see through the dim light. The fog outside seemed to creep into the car itself, distorting my view, but I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow that wasn't there before. It was subtle, a mere flicker in the darkness, but enough to send a jolt of fear down my spine. Before I could react, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static filling the silence. I hadn't touched the dial, hadn't even thought about turning it on, but the noise blared through the speakers, harsh and grating. I reached out with trembling fingers to turn it off, but before I could, a voice emerged from the static, a low, garbled whisper, barely audible but unmistakably there. "You can't run," it said, the words drawn out in a chilling monotone. "You can't hide." My breath caught in my throat, and I yanked the steering wheel, pulling the car to the side of the road with a screech of tires. The whispering continued, mingling with the crackling static, and I fumbled with the radio, desperate to silence it. But no matter how many buttons I pressed, the voice persisted, relentless and unyielding. "It's too late," it repeated, over and over, the words sinking into my mind like jagged shards of glass. "You've already let him in." Finally, I managed to cut the power, and the car fell into an oppressive silence once more. I sat there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, thick and suffocating, as if the very night itself was closing in around me. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the panic that was clawing at my insides. But the sense of dread was overwhelming, a suffocating presence that refused to let go. I had to know. I had to see what was lurking behind me, what had invaded the safety of my car, of my mind. Slowly, as if moving through water, I turned in my seat and looked into the back. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw him, the hitchhiker. He was sitting there, as if he had always been, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. His presence filled the space, making the car feel smaller, more claustrophobic. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curling of the lips that held no warmth, no humanity. "You should have never stopped," he said, his voice low and echoing with an otherworldly timbre. It was the same voice that had come through the radio, but now it was clear, unmistakably real. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him what he wanted, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, and the words were trapped behind a wall of terror. He leaned forward, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. "I'm your passenger now," he whispered, his breath cold against my ear. "We're bound together, you and I. You can't escape me." His words were a chilling promise, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I wanted to scream, to leap out of the car and run into the night, but I was paralyzed, held in place by the sheer weight of his presence. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to break free from this nightmare. But deep down, I knew there was no escape. He was right, I had let him in, and now he was a part of me, a dark shadow that would follow me wherever I went. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. There was no way out. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own car, with a demon sitting in the back seat. And then, just as I thought I might outrun the terror that had claimed me, the car began to slow. The engine sputtered and choked, and I realized with a sinking dread that I was running out of gas. I glanced at the fuel gauge, watching the needle dip into the red, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The hitchhiker's smile widened, and he leaned back, as if settling in for the inevitable. The car coasted to a stop, the engine coughing one last time before falling silent. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, staring out into the endless fog that wrapped around the car like a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the soft ticking of the cooling engine, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him there, his presence pressing down on me like a physical weight. The hitchhiker. My passenger. My captor. The fog outside was impenetrable, a wall of white that obscured everything beyond the hood of the car. It was as if the world had ended, leaving me alone in this nightmarish limbo. The cold seeped into the car, chilling me to the bone, but I couldn't move, couldn't even think beyond the overwhelming terror that had taken hold of me. I knew, with a sick certainty, that there was no help coming. No one would find me out here. I was alone with him, and there was no escape. "Why are you doing this?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt feeble, meaningless, but I had to say something, anything to break the unbearable silence. My voice trembled with fear, the sound of it foreign in the stillness of the night. The hitchhiker didn't answer right away. When he did speak, his voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made my blood run cold. "You think you can just drive away from your sins?" he asked, his tone laced with a dark amusement. "You can't outrun them. They'll always catch up to you in the end." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. "What sins? What was he talking about? I racked my brain, trying to understand, but nothing made sense. He leaned forward, his face emerging from the shadows, and for the first time, I saw his eyes clearly. They were dark, bottomless pits, voids that seemed to swallow the light, and in them, I saw flashes of something, images, memories, moments from my life that I had long buried. The broken promises, the lies, the betrayals. All the things I had done, the things I had tried to forget, played out in those eyes, each one more damning than the last. And with each memory, the hitchhiker's smile grew wider, more sinister. "You've carried these with you for a long time," he said, his voice now a soft whisper that seemed to echo inside my skull. "They've weighed you down, haven't they? And now, they've found you." His words hung in the air, heavy with a truth I couldn't deny. The realization hit me like a blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. This wasn't just some ghost, some demon that had latched onto me. He was a manifestation of everything I had tried to leave behind, everything I had buried deep inside, hoping it would stay forgotten. The hitchhiker was my past, and he had finally caught up to me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as if I could deny it, as if I could undo everything that had led me to this moment. "This can't be happening." But even as I said the words, I knew they were futile. There was no escaping this, no running from the truth that had followed me down every road, in every quiet moment of solitude. I had been driving in circles, trying to outrun the inevitable, but it had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hitchhiker's eyes never left mine, his gaze holding me captive as the memories continued to flood my mind, each one a knife twisted deeper into my soul. "You're trapped," he said, his voice barely more than a breath, but it resonated with finality. "And you'll stay trapped until you confront what you've done. Until you face the truth." Desperation clawed at me, a primal urge to fight, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The car was dead, the fog an impenetrable barrier, and the hitchhiker, he was inside my mind as much as he was in the back seat. I could feel my sanity slipping, unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. The walls were closing in, and I was powerless to stop it. With a deep breath, I forced myself to speak, though my voice was barely audible. What do you want me to do?" The question was a plea, a final, desperate bid for mercy, though I knew it was futile. The hitchhiker's smile widened, and for the first time, I saw something else in his eyes, pity. "It's not about what I want," he said softly. "It's about what you need. You have to make peace with it, or you'll be driving these roads forever, a ghost in your own life." His words struck deep, a revelation that both terrified and freed me. This was my penance, my reckoning. And there was no way out but through. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, suffocating but undeniable. When I opened them again, the fog had begun to thin, and the hitchhiker was gone, leaving only the echo of his final words hanging in the air. The road ahead was clear now, but I knew the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and it was one I had to face alone. As I started the car and began to drive, the darkness closed in around me, but this time, I wasn't afraid. The hitchhiker's presence lingered, a shadow in the rearview mirror, but I understood now. He was a part of me, and until I faced what I had done, he would always be there, a reminder of the road I had chosen. And so I drove on, into the night, with the specter of my past riding beside me, guiding me toward the inevitable reckoning that awaited at the end of the road. The car engine sputtered to life once more, but this time, I knew that the road ahead held more than just miles. It held my redemption, or my doom. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Broadcast. The attic was a place I had avoided for years, even though it had been part of my house for as long as I could remember. It was a cavernous, shadow-filled space that always seemed too cold, too silent, as if time itself had forgotten about it. I only ventured up there after my father's sudden death, hoping to find something, anything, that could provide some closure. The air was thick with dust and nostalgia, every creak of the floorboards unsettling in the heavy quiet. It was there, amidst the relics of my childhood, that I found the old radio. It was buried under a pile of moth-eaten blankets and old photo albums, its once shiny exterior now dull and worn. Despite its age, it was in surprisingly good condition. The faded brass dials and cracked leather casing gave it a kind of tragic dignity, as if it had been waiting all these years to be discovered again. I brushed off the dust, and an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. The sensation lingered, a heavy weight pressing on my chest as I carried the radio downstairs. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I placed the radio on the kitchen table, plugged it in, and turned the dial. Static crackled through the speaker, a familiar yet unsettling sound that echoed through the empty house. I adjusted the dial, expecting to find the usual stations, but the static continued until, suddenly, it didn't. A voice broke through, clear and eerily calm. "This just in, a local man has been found dead in his home under mysterious circumstances." I froze. The voice on the radio continued to speak, but it wasn't just the content that was disturbing, it was the fact that the voice was describing my house, my life, in unnerving detail. My heart raced as the voice reported the discovery of a body, my body, in the very room where I now sat. I turned the dial frantically, but the voice persisted, growing more insistent with each twist. Authorities are baffled by the scene. No signs of forced entry, no apparent cause of death. It's as if he simply ceased to exist. My breath caught in my throat. The voice seemed to be drawing nearer, the words wrapping around me like a cold embrace. In a panic, I unplugged the radio, the room plunging into an unsettling silence. The only sound was the blood rushing in my ears and the frantic pounding of my heart. I stared at the darkened radio, half expecting the voice to continue even without power. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was just a coincidence, a malfunction, but deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong with that radio, something deeply, unnervingly wrong. As I lay in bed, my mind racing, I realized I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know more. The radio was more than just an object, it was a harbinger, a doorway to something far darker than I could have imagined. And as much as I feared what I might find, I knew I had no choice but to confront it. The next morning, I awoke with a sense of dread that clung to me like a shadow. The radio sat on the kitchen table, inert and harmless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow watching me. It was ridiculous, of course, an old, dusty radio couldn't watch anyone. But the memory of that voice, so calm and precise in its description of my death, haunted me. It gnawed at the edges of my sanity, making the familiar feel alien and the safe seem sinister. I spent the day trying to go about my usual routine, but my mind kept drifting back to the radio. Every so often, I would find myself standing in the kitchen, staring at it, wondering if I had imagined the entire episode. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The details were too vivid, too real. I needed to know if it would happen again, if the voice would return. I had to know what it wanted. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in the dim, orange light of dusk, I plugged the radio back in. The hum of static filled the room immediately, and my heart began to race. I turned the dial slowly, hesitating, dreading what I might hear. At first, there was nothing, just a crackle of empty air. But then, as if it had been waiting for me, the voice returned. "This just in, the investigation into the death of the local man has taken a strange turn." The voice was the same, calm, deliberate, unnervingly familiar. "Authorities have discovered evidence that suggests the man was aware of his impending death. Neighbors report seeing him acting strangely in the days leading up to his demise, as if he knew something was coming for him." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The voice wasn't just describing my death, it was describing my thoughts, my actions. It knew. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. "No, this can't be real," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, as if I didn't even believe them myself. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching me, but there was only the radio, its static-filled speaker crackling ominously. The voice continued. Witnesses claim they saw him speaking to himself, as if conversing with an unseen entity. Some say they heard him pleading, others say they heard him laughing. My breath hitched. I had been talking to myself more lately, trying to rationalize what was happening, but the way the voice described it made it sound deranged. Was I losing my mind? Or was something else at play here, something beyond comprehension? I had to stop it. I reached for the plug, intending to silence the radio once again, but just as my fingers brushed the cord, the voice spoke my name. I froze, my hand trembling. "He's listening now," the voice said softly, almost affectionately. "He knows we're talking about him. And he knows that there's no escape." My stomach turned to ice. The voice was no longer just a broadcaster, it was addressing me directly. I yanked the plug from the wall, and the voice cut off abruptly, leaving me in the oppressive silence once more. But the damage was done. I had heard it speak my name, and the fear it instilled in me was beyond anything I had ever known. The hours that followed were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry a hidden threat. I was no longer alone in my home, something else was there with me, something that knew me intimately, something that wanted me dead. And worst of all, it was patient. It had waited this long, it could wait longer. But I couldn't. I had to understand what was happening. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever fate the radio had predicted for me. I needed answers, and I knew there was only one place I might find them, in the attic, where this nightmare had begun. The stairs to the attic creaked underfoot as I ascended, the narrow beam of my flashlight slicing through the thick darkness. The house felt different now, heavier, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The attic door loomed ahead, its wooden surface splintered and worn, yet somehow more menacing than I remembered. It was as if the entire house was conspiring to keep me from going back up there, but I had no choice. Whatever was happening, it had started in the attic, and I was determined to end it there. Pushing the door open, I was greeted by the same musty air and forgotten relics. The beam of my flashlight danced across old trunks, broken furniture, and boxes of yellowed papers. But there was something different about the attic now, an energy that hadn't been there before. It was subtle at first, a slight tingling on the back of my neck, but it grew stronger the longer I stood there. It was as if the air itself was charged with a malevolent intent, thickening with each breath I took. I approached the spot where I had found the radio, my heart pounding. The blankets and photo albums were undisturbed, exactly as I had left them. But as I crouched down to inspect the area, my flashlight flickered. I tapped it, but the light continued to waver, the darkness around me thickening with every moment. And then, just as the beam of light steadied, I saw it, a small, wooden box tucked beneath the floorboards. I pried the box loose, my hands trembling. It was old, the wood smooth and polished with age, yet still solid. The lid creaked as I opened it, revealing its contents, a stack of faded photographs, a brittle piece of parchment, and a small, leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal, its cover worn but the pages intact. The name on the first page made my blood run cold, Arthur Price, my father. The journal's pages were filled with cramped, hurried handwriting, detailing things I could barely comprehend. My father had written about the radio, about how he had found it years ago, hidden in the very same spot. His entries grew more frantic as the pages turned, his neat script devolving into illegible scrawls. He wrote of the same voice, the same terrifying broadcasts that predicted his death. He had tried to destroy the radio, to rid himself of its influence, but it had always returned, and each time, the predictions had grown more accurate, more personal. My father had been a man of science, logical and grounded. Yet, in these pages, he confessed to things that defied reason. He described conversations with the voice, pleas for mercy, and warnings that had gone unheeded. The last entry was dated just days before his death. The voice knows too much. It's not just predicting my death, it's controlling it. I fear it has already decided my fate. I can only hope that my son never finds this radio. God help him if he does. The journal slipped from my hands, the words burning in my mind. My father had known, and he had tried to protect me. But it was too late. I had found the radio, and now, it was my turn. The air in the attic grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me, unseen but unmistakable. I turned, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the quiet hum of the house. Then I heard it. A soft whisper, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. "He's here," the voice said, barely more than a breath. "He knows the truth now." I fled the attic, the journal clutched to my chest. I had to escape, to get away from this cursed house, but deep down, I knew there was no escape. The radio's influence extended far beyond these walls, its power reaching into the very core of my being. As I stumbled down the stairs, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't in control anymore. The voice was. And it wasn't done with me yet. I barely remember stumbling down the stairs, the weight of my father's journal heavy in my hands. The house, once familiar, had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights felt like the house was alive, watching my every move. I reached the kitchen, gasping for breath, and there it was, the radio, sitting quietly on the table as if it had never uttered a word of doom. But I knew better. That radio was a conduit, a bridge between this world and whatever hellish place the voice came from. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, intending to smash it against the wall, to destroy it once and for all. But just as I raised it above my head, the radio came to life. "This just in," the voice said, calm and eerily controlled. "The local man has taken drastic measures to avoid his fate, but it's too late. His destiny was sealed the moment he turned that dial. His death is inevitable, and there's nothing he can do to stop it." I dropped the radio, and it clattered onto the table, but the voice continued, relentless. "The house is no longer safe. He knows too much, and the entity will not let him leave. He is trapped within its grasp, and soon, very soon, it will claim what is rightfully his." Panic seized me. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. The voice was no longer just a harbinger, it was a sentence, a final decree. I ran to the door, desperate to escape, but as I reached for the handle, I felt an icy wind whip through the house. The lights flickered, and the radio's voice grew louder, more insistent. "There's no escape. He must accept his fate. The entity is already here, and it will not be denied." I turned to look back at the radio, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, darker than the blackest night, materializing in the corner of the room. It moved with unnatural fluidity, spreading across the floor, crawling up the walls like a living nightmare. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow took form, a grotesque mockery of a human figure, its eyes nothing more than hollow voids. It stared at me with a hunger that transcended anything mortal. The voice on the radio grew quieter, almost reverent. "The entity has come to collect its due. He cannot escape. It has waited too long, and now, it will consume him." My legs refused to move, paralyzed by a terror so deep it felt like my very soul was being stripped away. The shadow creature advanced slowly, savoring each step as it drew closer. I could feel its coldness seeping into the air, chilling me to the bone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, a lamb before the slaughter. "Please, no," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. The shadow loomed over me, its presence suffocating, and then it spoke, not in words, but in thoughts, in emotions that invaded my mind with brutal force. It showed me visions of my death, of my body lying cold and lifeless in this very room, the same scenes the voice had described. But there was something more, a darkness that went beyond death, an eternity of torment and despair that awaited me in the void. The radio crackled one last time. "The broadcast ends here. The cycle is complete." With those final words, the shadow lunged at me, and everything went black. My screams were swallowed by the darkness, lost in the void where no sound could reach. I felt myself falling, not just physically, but spiritually, into a place where light could never exist. And in those final moments, I understood the truth. The radio had been a tool, a way to lure me to my doom. The entity had been waiting for me, waiting for the right time to claim my soul. And now, it had succeeded. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.